The photograph failed first, not in the way one imagines a camera failing, no dramatic flicker of light, no obvious mechanical hiss, but as if the negative had simply refused to hold him. The packet the photographer slid across the sacristy table that afternoon was a pale rectangle with a smear traveling where his eyes should have been, a soft gray trail that ate the place where you expect to find a person's watching. Everyone looked at it as if it were a spell. The printer's apprentice blinked. The florist looked down at his hands arranging a corsage. My mother smoothed the wrong edge of her sleeve and said nothing at all. We had rehearsed the ceremony like a machine. My family practices rehearsals the way other families practice grace, with the same kind of discipline, with lists that grow like little ledgers. There were the usher's cues, the exact angle at which the bridesmaids' bouquets were to be held, the steward's steps across the nave. We had practiced the bow the way one practices a signature, deliberately, until it felt like the natural shape of the body. But rehearsals do not account for the stubbornness of objects with histories. The ledger, for example, is an object that carries its own weather. It is a heavy book bound in thick leather, its page edges gilded in years of oxidation, the stub of a ribbon like a bookmark for a century. My husband's family keeps it under glass in a study that smells like old ink and lemon oil. It has been passed down from hand to hand, and the keeper of the ledger, the steward, has a key and a solemn way of speaking. People say, half joking and finally with seriousness, that the ledger remembers. It remembers names that have been scrubbed from stone. It remembers debts that did not appear in any modern ledger. It remembers the little domestic economies of shame and preservation that do not fit into balance sheets. We had signed a prenuptial covenant because that is what is done in these families. The covenant is not merely about money. It is a ceremonial document, a set of instructions and a register, written in careful script with annotations in the margins. The lawyer who drafted it read aloud the clauses in a voice that made anodyne phrases sound like altar call. Allocation of endowments, he intoned. Custodianship of private papers, he said. At one point, to be precise, and to preserve the ritual clarity of the day, the steward unfolded his gloves and placed the ledger on the table between us. The room tightened. I remember thinking how odd it was that a book could have such agency. My father, an accountant by training, a man for whom the world always resolved itself into ledgers and footnotes, had always treated continuity as a craft. He believed in inherited obligations the way others believe in prayer. In our house, we lined our portraits like entries in a register, grandmother's brass frame, great-aunt's oval. Each face had its own little list of works and bequests, its own margin notes in pencil, its own small script of admonition. We grew up believing performances could be rehearsed into sincerity. A family shows its solidity not in declarations, but in the careful repetition of small acts, proper arrival times, discreet donations, the attendance at wakes. To be visible meant to be carefully trained. When I met him, Elliot, he seemed at first to be the unadorned answer to a long list of private desires. He read in corners of the city I frequented, a bookshop that smelled of glue and rain. He wrote marginalia the way a person writes notes in the margins of a life, spare, affectionate, a comment passed like a note across a desk. He once left a penciled line in a used copy of Montaigne, "Be small enough to be heard," and I found it as if someone had given me a small, necessary kindness. We fell into courtship more slowly than I expected. The first months were made of quiet exchanges rather than public displays. He would fix the bindings of my old letters for me, his fingers nimble and thoughtful, and then hand them back with a small crease folded into the corner of each envelope, the way one mends a sleeve. These were the things I loved, these small repairs, this particular brand of ordinary attention, because they required no performance beyond fidelity. There is a momentness to all of these domestic arts. Attention gives shape to duration. But the ledger is not only a repository of names, it is a compact of obligations, an ossified choreography that asks someone to continue what one family calls continuity. The steward explained the ledger's function to me once in the study, where dust hung in the sun like a photograph. "It is a record," he said, penciling a line in one of his own notebooks. "It indicates who is responsible for what. Endowments, maintenance, the naming of things. We treat it like any good book, with respect. But some families come to think of the ledger as a life, and a life as something to be given rather than inhabited. He spoke it as if he were describing a machine and as if he were warning me. We signed the covenant because we thought ourselves capable of negotiation. In the lawyer's office, there were phrases underlined, paragraphs with marginalia. Custodial assignment to spouse, in the event of incapacity. The lawyer underlined the phrase and then pushed his glasses up his nose as if to say, pay attention to the grammar of consent. My parents came with their own whispers of contingency. My mother wanted assurances that the house would remain a place where portraiture could continue, where the brides on the wall would have successors who learned the right way to preside over a dinner. My father wanted precise accounting, figures with decimal points. Elliot listened to all of it with the patient face he wore in private. Unhurried, considerate, the kind of gentleness I had thought of as a blessing. At one point, he took the ledger's cover in his hands, his fingers making a small circle in the worn leather, and then he closed the book as if closing a conversation. It is heavy, he said. I know how to carry things. The steward cleared his throat and offered to demonstrate the ritual of ring warming. It is an old custom. The ring is passed through the palms of the congregation to gather some warmth, some blessing, whatever people call it. They held the ring between them like an incandescent secret. The steward, in his cotton gloves, then placed both the ring and a folded corner of the ledger on the cloth that lay across the altar. The gesture was unremarkable to those who have grown up with rituals. It was not meant to be an enchantment, but in a room where so much of life had been arranged as performance, the smallest misalignment becomes legible as fate. The first image, my memory returns to that smear on the negative, came as we posed for the official portrait after the ceremony. I stood on a riser beside the velvet-draped harpist and smiled in the practiced way my lineage taught me to smile, an easy tilt of the head, the hand resting on a forearm. Elliot stood where he had always stood in my mind, steady, slightly backlit, his mouth forming a line of contentment. The photographer called out a number, the flashes touched the air once, twice, and when the young technician handed me the proof later, the place where his eyes should have been was a soft absence, as if the world had simply misplaced them. When I looked at Elliot directly across the table that afternoon, he did not blink. It is perhaps too theatrical to fixate on that one failure, too easy to make it into sin or omen. Still, when you are trained to watch faces and to register the pauses that tell a story, the absence of a blink reads like a sentence in a language you think you knew. People notice blinking. We learn from infancy that a look is punctuated, that eyes have grammar. The lack of that punctuation unsettled me in a way my rehearsals had not prepared for. In the beginning, the family invented rationalities. The photographer admitted to a technical failure and apologized. The chemical batch was off, he said, his palms dusted in the fine gray of fixer. The florist claimed that he had been adjusting lights when the moment passed. He had, in his defense, to keep the lilies from wilting in a heated hall. My mother, practical as a ledger, arranged a small statement. The negative was a fluke, nothing more. My father, embarrassed on behalf of the family, insisted the town would move on if we issued the right statements. But statements do not, and cannot, do all the work. News of the photograph moved with the merciless geometry of rumor. By the end of the week, there were sketchy accounts and opinion pieces, some kind, some cruel. One column suggested that the marriage had produced a personality that simply did not conform to the expectations of public life. The word malfunction appeared in the margins of a few more formal pieces. A late-night host made a joke about the poor man's blinking habits. The phrase "not human" surfaced in the worst stories, printed as an accusation and then quoted back to us like a challenge. We tried containment. We rehearsed interviews. We issued a short, careful release that combined gratitude for well-wishers with a request for privacy. I attend to language in these situations. Words perform the function of social mending. Our lawyer went to work drafting language that would both keep our private business private and protect our interests. Phrases about personal autonomy, about the sanctity of private life, about inchoate rumor. And the steward, who had been present for generations longer than most living relatives, moved through the house making small interventions. He would rearrange a chair. He would remove a framed photograph from the place it had occupied for decades and replace it with another, as if an attentive curator could manage grief and curiosity the way one manages an archive. There were private arguments, too. My mother was furious that any hint of scandal should find its way into her dinner party history. My father made calculations, figurative and literal, that concerned the fiscal ramifications of publicity. "We cannot have our holdings understood in this way," he said more than once, his voice steady like a ledger's column. I, who had been groomed for performance, felt my training fail me. How do you make a choreography when one partner is no longer playing the same music? Mostly I watched Elliot withdraw. He repelled attention like an old varnished box. He refused interviews. He would not attend the philanthropic tea where I was expected to appear in a column devoted to grace under scrutiny. Instead, he took to the house's small back room where he repaired bindings and attended to marginalia. He used needle and thread to restitch old family volumes. He translated ancient inscriptions from the margins into lists of names on loose leaves. He would spend hours aligning the spines of books so their titles formed a soft horizon along the shelf. The steward, who had been a presence in his life for as long as I had known him, became his ally in these labors. People are inclined to narrativize quiet acts into spectacle. Some journalists described his behavior, the refusal to make small talk, the lack of attendance on the social circuit, as asceticism. Others cast it as a kind of effective withdrawal, a refusal to play the part of a modern husband. The more sensational accounts layered on more violence. They wrote as if the ledger had leapt into him and stolen the tender parts. I did not trust those accounts. My mind refused the ledger as possession story because it wanted to keep him intact as a person, not a vessel. Yet there was something in the way he moved through rooms, the way he would linger for a long time with a photograph as if listening to its silences, that made me sometimes suspect he had assumed something weighty, a burden the family had not offered him as a gift to choose. There was a meeting at the solicitor's office the week after the honeymoon, a small room with glass partitions and a clock that ticked with remarkable equanimity. My father attended, the steward attended, the lawyer who had drafted the covenant attended and took notes in a tight, cursive hand. They petitioned that the language of the covenant be clarified. Under what circumstances did custodianship transfer? What constituted incapacity? Could duties be delegated? They argued, in the precise language of law, that the ledger's obligations were not metaphysical commands, but social ones. They could be reassigned, reallocated. And Elliot, when asked, looked at us with that particular steadiness he now carried and said, "I will do what needs doing." He said it as if he were making an arithmetic correction, as if it were a line item to be checked off. I remember the steward's hand on his elbow, not as a grip but as a small anchoring touch, mutual, practical. "You understand," the steward said quietly, "that these are not merely accountings. These are people's names." There was an economy of dignity that I had not appreciated until that moment. To take on a ledger's obligation is not like signing a check. It is to step into other people's stories and decide whether to continue them or let them break. There is an ethics to that, a question of consent, of agency. I thus began to feel the twin weights of gratitude and guilt in my chest. Gratitude because his withdrawal seemed to spare me the burden of being the family's primary steward. He took to memory and paper like water to a thirsty soil. Guilt because I wondered whether his new comportment had been his choice or whether the lineage had been disguised as an inheritance and loosed upon his shoulders. After the meetings, the family attempted to domesticate the narrative. There were press releases that used the passive voice to attenuate responsibility, articles that emphasized ordinary household rearrangements, and a statement from the steward that described Elliot's choice to step away from public duties and tend to the private archives. We sent a carefully worded note to the local paper decrying speculation and asserting that private choices are to be respected. The town, which loves spectacle and despises the unexplained, shifted its gaze in small waves, like water responding to a pebble. All the while in the house, small rituals accumulated. I found myself learning the domestic apprenticeship that Elliot had always performed with such simple devotion. He taught me how to mend the hinge of a book so that it could open again without wincing, how to soften the leather of a cover that had been rebuffed by dryness. He showed me how to fold a letter so the creases would not break the ink, how to make tea that was neither too strong nor too weak, but the exact temperature that releases subtle aromatic notes. These were not grand acts. They were the work of quotidian stewardship, of keeping things serviceable, legible, and warm. And yet doing them made me more present in a way my previous life of receptions and patterned smiles had not. There were mornings when his face seemed truly like a man's face, and not like the photograph's blot. He would laugh at a joke I made and tilt his head. His eyes would find mine and hold with a fluency that made me remember the man I had loved in the bookshop. There were times when he was unreadable, as if his attention had been drawn into the thin white fissure of paper and vanished. The ambiguity made everything more complicated. To love is to accept paradox, to prefer a person whose interiority sometimes refracts into practices one cannot wholly interpret. Neighbors adjusted to his withdrawal the way one adjusts to the weather. The bookshop owner, a woman who kept biscuits in a jar behind the counter, became our small confidant. "He's been very kind to the old collections," she told me, pressing a packet of tea into my hands the morning after the press conference. The market clerk brought me a hand-measured bundle of radishes and said nothing about his face. He only asked after my mother. People practiced ordinary civility, which, in our small world, felt like a form of shelter. There were nights, many of them, when I would sit in the study and watch Elliot work. He would sit at the long table, a lamp illuminating the page, his mouth a slight line. He kept his hands warm with woolen fingerless gloves, and the slow rhythm of his hands mending was like a chant. He would transcribe names, sometimes in a hand that was not his, sometimes copying worn entries into fresh leaves as if reenacting the writing of someone long dead. He told me little about why he had chosen this life. When I asked him, he said, "The ledger asks less of me than it does of those who think themselves its heirs." That answer made sense and did not make sense. It contained both an ethics and a refusal. I learned this. There is a difference between being assigned an obligation by a family and choosing to carry something for someone else. He carried pages and names because, in his own way, he wished to preserve the small economies of the house. The recipes scribbled between the legalese, the letters folded into the back of a Bible. To anyone else, these might have been quantities. To him, they were histories that could not be allowed to disappear. When he tended those margins, he tended to people. It is a modest heroism, not the kind that gets written into toast of the town columns, but a heroism all the same. The weeks doubled into months. The press cycle moved on as these things do, hunting fresh beasts of attention. People wrote think pieces about performance and identity, about whether one could, in modern life, be both authentic and performative. A few essays wondered aloud whether the ledger was itself a metaphor for the ways in which we ask others to contain our stories. Those essays comforted me and annoyed me in equal measure. They were, after all, written by people who had not seen my husband set a spine with the kind of patience that is akin to prayer. And still the photograph remained in my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I would pull it out and study the blur. I would imagine what the negative had tried to tell us, that the eyes were the place where someone claims their human particularity, and that the absence of blink was a question about attention, about consent. On more practical days, I pitched small projects, to reframe the family portraits, to move the picture frames so that the newly married couple would be placed where no one could comment on a failed negative. On other days, I resented the softness of my own vanity, that my life had been arranged to be seen, and I would tell myself to be more brave, more ready to bear witness without insisting on an audience. A small rupture in our domestic routine underscored the moral differences between gratitude and obligation. One Saturday, when the rain had flattened the city into a gray sheet, Elliot refused to come with me to a patron's luncheon I had promised to attend. "The house needs me today," he said, and his voice was level. He moved about with the measured economy of someone who has learned the dance of care. I went alone, policed my smile through courses, and returned to find him at the table with a pen in his hand, copying, line by line, a faded list of parish donors from a ledger that had been eaten at the corners. When I asked him why he had taken so much on, his answer was simple and direct, and it haunted me. "Someone had to keep the names," he said. "If not us, then they unmake themselves. I know what the line items mean. He said this not as a martyr would, but as a man who understood the arithmetic of small kindnesses. There is no shortage of easy narratives to tell about him. People prefer the simple stories, the man possessed, the man who refuses to be part of society. But I believe that he was, in his way, choosing. One of the steward's phrases stuck with me. We do not wish to force continuity upon another without asking them to consent. It is a delicate phrase and at times painfully abstract, but it opened a door in me. If he had accepted the ledger's labor as agency, then our marriage had to be rearticulated not as a public performance that rehearsed the family's assumptions, but as an ongoing choice of small attentions. This is the crux toward which I began to lean. The house's obligations could not simply be shrugged off by issuing a press release or by shuffling endowments. To unbind privilege is not only an act of public policy, it is a domestic pedagogy. I realized I had to learn to do the ordinary things, mending, making tea, buying seed packets in spring, because the moral cost of unbinding a system is not paid by documents alone. It is paid by the person who takes up the work. There, then, followed a series of small experiments. We rehung portraits a little lower so their faces were less enamel bright and more intimate. I began to visit the bookshop with regularity, asking the owner about the best way to preserve paper, learning about the kinds of glue that do not yellow over time. I made lists the way my father had once done, a margin for gratitude, a column for duty. At the market, I learned to ask the vendors what they preferred in terms of payment. Sometimes they asked for kindness, sometimes for the quiet of being unnoticed. These were not grand gestures. They were instead the daily accrual of a life worth living. At the edge of this new apprenticeship came a question I rehearsed in my head like a speech I had not yet dared to give. It hummed at the back of my throat when I saw him at the table, copying names into new leaves. It fluttered like a slipped seam when I adjusted a photograph. The question was simple. Would you choose me without the covenant? I practiced the phrasing because I wanted it to be clean, free of familial jargon and the heavy grammar of legal obligation. I wanted to lay it bare as if we were a couple in a tiny room with the only microphone a kettle. Would you choose me without the ledger as backdrop? Would you choose me for the small, unheralded things? The question is perhaps obvious in its honesty, and yet I felt I had been trained, by upbringing, by the social world, to place such an inquiry into a ceremonial frame. But ceremony is not always preparation for truth. There were days when he seemed to answer the question without me asking it. He would bring me a cup of tea with a list of things he'd found in a marginal note. Remember to forgive the gooseberries. This list was playful and tender, a kind of private liturgy. He would fold it into my palm with a confidence that was not altogether theatrical. There were other days when his attention returned to the ledger like a man to a job he loved, and I, watching, felt both pride and loneliness. I did not intend for a confrontation to become dramatic. I wanted instead for it to be ordinary. So I planned a small evening in the study with the lamp low and the rain patterning the glass. There would be no guests, no speeches, no carefully staged photograph. I would ask him then, in our private room, whether his assumption of custodianship had been his own. I told myself that I would listen and that I would not interrupt. The steward, when I told him of my plan, said nothing helpful. He folded his hands and looked past me at the shelves. Choice, he said at last, is more interesting than inheritance. He did not smile, but there was in his face a slight, almost admiring tilt, the kind of look someone gives when they witness an experiment in ethics rather than an act of choreography. The lawyer, for his part, advised caution. You must phrase your question in a way that does not create an ultimatum, he said. Consent is more durable when it is freely given. If you enjoy the kind of story that sits in its questions for a long time, if you like the slow work of watching a life be rearranged rather than the fireworks of scandal, then stay with me. There will be no dramatic exorcism here, no spectacular reversal. There will be instead small acts that aggregate into moral architecture. On the night I chose to ask, the study smelled of lemon peel and the faint dust of old books. Elliot sat where he always sat, the lamp making a small halo around the page he was copying. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment his face was simply the one I loved. A particular mouth, the slope of his cheek, the way his fingers curled as if around an invisible pen. My throat tightened. I had practiced nothing like a speech. I had rehearsed only the backbone of a question. Before I spoke, he closed the ledger and pushed it toward me with a gentle movement, the way a host pushes a plate across a table when offering the best of himself. "I want to show you something else," he said. He opened a drawer and brought out a small stack of letters, their corners yellowed, each envelope sealed and then slowly opened as if someone had learned to listen to paper. "These are the letters I have been copying," he said. "They are not all my concern. They belong to people who were not always recorded. I thought you should see them." I read, and in the habit of reading, I found my heart shifting. There were names I had never seen in our family tree, the lives of people who had been marginal and therefore missed by history. The letters were not grand. They were small notes of kindness, mentions of a daughter who had moved away, accounts of a winter where the heating failed. They were pieces of ordinary vulnerability that, collected, began to look like an ethical landscape. When I looked up, he watched me with a kind of acute gentleness. "I do it because I do not want those people to be forgotten," he said, "and because I want to know how to be useful." It was not an answer to my rehearsed question. It was an answer in another register entirely. Not legalistic, not theatrical, but human in the most basic sense. It reframed the ledger as a place where the world might be withheld from oblivion. I had expected that moment to clarify everything. Instead, it deepened the ambiguity. His acts were chosen and tender, but they were also acts that made him less visible in the public world, where I had once hoped to be seen as an equal partner in spectacle. He had made himself a keeper, and the keeping felt like a moral good. But what does it mean to choose a person who has chosen to vanish into duty? Is that choice shared, or does it become a self-sacrificing shape written into the domestic architecture by expectation? I did not have the answer that night. We drank our tea in silence and listened to the rain. The ink on the margins looked brighter in the lamp's glow. The photograph with the smear lay in a drawer, a small, stubborn negative that refused to be explained away. I slept poorly, and in the midst of the night, I woke with the sense that the house had become a ledger itself, a small account book of the choices we had made and the names we had not yet reconciled. Morning brought an ordinary demand. The gardener wanted to know whether the ivy should be pruned before the spring display, and a neighbor asked whether I would contribute to the children's library. These small things yanked the world back into the practical. There was a letter from a journalist requesting an interview, and another from a parishioner asking for a donation. Life, it seemed, continues its unglamorous gravity, regardless of the magnitude of one's questions. So I set out into the day with the question rehearsed but unasked. There is an odd courage to postponing the important things, an illusion that time will strengthen the words into clarity. I visited the bookshop and ran my fingers along rows of spines. The owner, who had become an ally in our small rearrangements, handed me a wedge of paper with a recommended treatment for cloth-bound books. "Keep the humidity steady," she said, "and don't be in a rush. Repairs love patience." When I returned home, the steward was at the kitchen table balancing a stack of receipts and a small list of places where portraits might be rehung. He looked up as I entered. "You have a look of someone who has practiced a question and then placed it into their pocket," he observed, and I laughed despite the tightness inside me. "Perhaps," I said. "Or perhaps I've decided I will not ask it like a judge, but like a neighbor." He considered this and nodded. "Neighbors practice presence," he said. "You can learn the form. It is a daily thing." The house, in the weeks that followed, continued to rearrange itself around the new economy of attention. We instituted evening practices, small liturgies that were not religious but domestic, a time to read together, a time to write marginal notes on whatever had been happening that day. We started a list of names we wanted to remember and pinned it on the pantry door. We began giving small anonymous donations, a subscription to a paper for a villager who could not afford one, a repair to the bell of a chapel that had stopped ringing. These were ordinary acts, but they were acts of a particular moral imagination, to attend to the margins as if they mattered, And yet, even as I busied myself with these tasks, the photograph smear was never far from my mind. There are things you reckon with directly, and there are things you must practice against by building up the rest of your life. The ledger's weight was both literal and metaphorical. I felt it in my bones. It is the feeling of a contract pressing on you, a private gravity that insists on being accounted for. To be married to a man who had stopped performing in public, who had become less visible to audiences and more visible to paper, is to inhabit a paradox. My life remained the public stage I had been trained for. His had shrunk to the intimate rooms of preservation. One afternoon, the gardener came in with a satchel of bulbs and a confession. "I heard them at the bakery," he said, as if gossip were a commodity he could unload. "They say he swallowed the ledger. Is that true?" He chuckled, but his eyes were curious and cruel in the way of small towns. I felt a response rise in me: exasperation, embarrassment, the urge to correct and to explain. And yet I also felt the steadier thing that had come to undergird our days. A protective impulse. It is a strange kind of tenderness to be protective of someone the world has already judged. "No," I said simply. He did not swallow a book. He decided to keep certain names safe. The gardener shrugged and left the bulbs on the kitchen table. He gloved his hands and pushed his cap back. People like stories with a kernel of horror. It gives them something to nibble on while they mind the rest of their days. But most people also prefer the soft glow of ordinary kindness when they are not at work. There are many things I could tell you about the months that came next. The way the photographs continued to misbehave sometimes and show smudges like erasures. The way friends who had once expected spectacle began to visit less. The way a parishioner sent a note of gratitude for the small repairs to his pew. I could tell you that we learned to be less performative and more committed. I could tell you that there were nights of bitter argument about money and privacy, and whether it was fair to ask a person to be both a husband and a repository of a family's unspoken debts. But the question that pulls me forward is not that of fairness in the abstract. It is the smaller, more vexing question of whether choosing someone in private means you choose them for the parts of life that others might expect them to continue. In our house, obligations are like old furniture. You can move them from room to room, but do not expect them to feel lighter. They have weight because people put them there. Only people can remove them. So now I keep watch in small ways. I look for the soft signs. The way Elliot will press a postage stamp to a corner of a letter with the same precision he uses to mend a spine. The way he pauses sometimes in the garden and names the plants as if they were names in a ledger. I practice asking him the same question anew in little phrases. Will you choose me? Will you choose me when no one watches? Will you choose me when it is not a public demonstration, but the tedious work of living? I have not yet given him the final phrasing that I rehearsed in the study. There are floors of conversation to walk down before that happens. There is the lawyer to contend with, the family to mollify, the town's appetite to manage. And there is the deeper business, to learn what it means to keep a person whole while asking them to bear a burden they did not ask for. The ledger sits on the shelf, under glass, a presence whose hush we have learned to respect. The photograph remains in a drawer like a small complaint. The steward goes about his tasks with the same unshowy precision. And Elliot, if you believe the gossip, if you read the cruelest pieces that were printed, is a man who does not blink, whose eyes have been stolen by an inhuman thing. But for me, who sits at his table and drinks his tea and watches his hands work the thread through the paper, he is a man who has become a keeper by his own peculiar will. I do not yet know what the cost of asking him to choose will be. I only know that it will require more than speeches and press releases. It will require me to learn the kinds of everyday attentions that amount over time to a moral architecture. It will require me to accept that gratitude and guilt can live together in a heart, that to love is not to erase burdens, but to engage with them, to see them, and to decide again and again to remain. Rain began again that afternoon, turning the garden into a liquid smear. I stood at the window and watched the rivulets trace the panes like ink wandering into the margins. The house was quiet. Somewhere in the rooms, a radio murmured an inconsequential news item. On the table, the photograph lay folded, a small thing that refused explanation. I took the ledger from the shelf, not to open it, but to feel its weight in my hands, and I thought of all the names it held, some rich, some poor, some long absent, all of them needing someone to remember them. Then I set the book back on the shelf and went into the study to find Elliot, who was, as always, bent over a page. I had not yet asked him the question in the terms I had practiced. Instead, I sat down and placed my hand over his for a moment. He looked up, and his eyes met mine with an expression I had not learned to parse, not an absence, not a simple return, but something like recognition folded into reserve. He did not say the rehearsed phrases I had been practicing in my head. Instead, he set the pen down, smoothed the paper with both palms as if to lay a small promise flat, and said quietly, "I have been choosing, though perhaps not always in ways you expected." The sentence was not an answer to the form of my question, but it was an answer to its spirit. I felt my throat tighten, not from relief, but from the slow, dangerous unspooling of comprehension. He shifted so that the lamplight touched his cheek in a way that made the tiny scars along his knuckles visible. "When I agreed to marry you," he continued, "I understood there would be obligations. But I thought I was marrying you, not a list." He let that sit between us, and in the small room it felt like an incision and a mending at once. We spoke then, not in the clear juridical language the solicitor preferred, but in the ordinary vocabulary of a household. I asked him if, in taking on the books and the names, he had done so because he felt compelled by our family's expectations, or because he had seen in the work an ethical horizon he wanted to steward. He answered that the two were entangled. "There was pressure," he admitted, "but it was not the only reason. I find steadiness in the work of preserving names. It is less about the ledger's voice and more about the people who sit in its margins." That phrasing, people in the margins, moved something in me. For the first time, the ledger stopped being an abstract fright and became a set of relationships, little histories that required tending. He explained with a patience I had come to rely upon. On some pages there were lists of charitable donations with no donor attached. On others there were mentions of births and small funerals that had been attended in anonymity. "I wanted to know how to keep those lives," he said. "To refuse that felt like letting a part of us vanish." I listened and felt both gratitude and a newly acute culpability. Gratitude because his choice, partial as it was, had eased a path for me to live without the constant heavy rehearsal of formal duty. Culpability because I began to understand that my family's idea of continuity had too often depended on invisibilities, people whose names were shifted into footnotes so that the main portraits could remain clean. My training in public performance had prepared me to inhabit a stage. It had not prepared me to hold the patient attention required for small, private preservation. We did not resolve everything that night, but we did resituate the terms of our life together. The next week, there was a meeting in which the lawyer and the steward and my father convened, ostensibly to redraw the prenuptial language into something less like a trap and more like a description of actual practice. The lawyer, who had the habit of solving moral problems with clauses, proposed an addendum that framed certain custodial tasks as voluntary, delegable, and subject to annual review. I listened to the legal phrasing, voluntary custodianship, delegation upon request, annual affirmation, and felt the relief of language that refused to fix a human into a ledger's margin without consent. We did not sign anything that bound Elliot forever. We offered instead a document of acknowledgement, a clear record that his duties were accepted knowingly and that there would be mechanisms to redistribute them should he ask. The steward, who had watched many such settlements, closed his notebook and said simply, "This makes room." His face, which had the flat calm of someone who has watched many families learn, showed what might be almost gratitude. I felt the truth of his observation. To transform an assumption into an acknowledged choice was to clear a path for moral practice. The town noticed, as towns do. There was a new set of articles that were slightly kinder, a profile that tried to place Elliot's withdrawal within a narrative of quiet goodness rather than threat. A couple of opinion pieces argued that we had handled things properly. Gossip kept its whispers, but moved on to other appetites. I do not tell this to praise our press strategy. Press strategies often make virtue of expediency. but to mark the way public narratives rearrange themselves when demanded by private ethics. At home, the slower work continued. The steward taught me more than the lawyer ever could about the ethics of care. He showed me how to flatten a creased folio with bread wrapped in muslin, an old conservation trick that smelled faintly of yeast and patience. He demonstrated the gentle stroke with which to remove a rusted paperclip so that the paper around it would not tear. He taught me the language of marginalia, how a note tucked into a page might be a love letter, a shopping list, a formal instruction. Where I had once seen ornament and rotation, plating the right dish at the right time, I began to see a moral topography whose streams I could, with practice, learn to trace. Across those months, Elliot and I developed a set of small practices that resembled liturgy without claiming the name. We made tea in a particular rhythm. First boil, then a minute for the leaves to settle, then pour with a steady hand into cups pre-warmed by our palms. We left notes in the pantry listing the names we had written down that week. We read aloud once a month from a list of the house's lesser-known benefactors. We wrote letters of thanks to people who had once been only names, sending them small tokens or repairs to the things they had loved. These acts had no headline but accrued, like interest, into a steadier ethic. There were setbacks. Once, a distant cousin, an aesthete who measured worth by visibility, suggested we host a public reading of The House's Treasures to celebrate the ledger's recovery of suppressed names. She meant well. Her impulse was to make the hidden visible. Elliot declined. He explained that memory thrives in certain kinds of privacy and that public revelation can convert honesty into spectacle. The cousin's disappointment was polite but palpable. My family's hunger for appearances is not easily sated. In that moment, I understood better the cost he had been paying. Invisibility in one register can mean moral autonomy in another. Times when his comportment returned to the readable man I had courted were tender and necessary. There were mornings when he would fetch the paper and read aloud a clipping about a minor cultural event, turning it into a private joke. He would trace the spine of an old cookbook and tell me the story of the woman who had scribbled a substitution in the margin 2 generations prior. He remembers these small authors of the household as if they were present. Names that for others would be mere marginalia became to him interlocutors. At such times his gaze, blink and all, resembled intimacy rather than the strange absence the photograph had suggested. Other times, however, his attention seemed to live partially in another register. He would sometimes stare at a photograph for so long that I felt ashamed to interrupt, as if the photograph contained an argument he was trying to resolve on paper. He would make lists of names and then, as if performing an arithmetic for the soul, decide where small sums should go. A subscription to a retired teacher, a roof mended for a woman who used to water the church's pots. Those acts were precise and unremarked. They also created distance. He was less present to the public world I inhabited, and I carried the choreography of receptions and committees with a new awareness of what it all cost. One winter, when the frost arrived early and the house smelled of orange peels and coal, there was a small crisis that revealed both his agency and the precariousness of our arrangement. A foundation, large, impressed by the symbolic weight of our family name, offered to underwrite a center for lineage and memory, proposing that the ledger be digitized, curated, and opened as an exhibition. The offer was generous. It would have ensured the ledger's physical preservation and possibly liberated the house from some of the more mundane expenses. The solicitor's office leaned toward accepting the funds. My father liked the idea of a national legacy. Public visibility seemed a pragmatic solution. Elliot refused. He listened to the foundation's representative, who spoke in an efficient architecture of mission statements, and then he declined with a clarity that surprised everyone. "The ledger is not a museum artifact to be housed in a gallery," he said. "It is not that the names should be hidden forever. It is that the names are lives connected to people who may not want their stories told in a public forum." He argued for small care rather than institutional spectacle, for handwritten letters and discreet maintenance instead of an exhibition that would turn privacy into a commodity. His refusal produced indignation among some and admiration among others. I, who had always been ambivalent about public honors, found myself proud of him in a way I had never been proud of any public triumph. He had articulated an ethic that refused to convert memory into currency. Yet his stance forced us to renegotiate our financial affairs. Without the foundation's funds, we needed to redistribute some maintenance costs. The recalibration was practical. Adjustments to the household income, a few prudent meetings with accountants, but it also reiterated an important lesson. Moral choices have economic consequences, and if one refuses to monetize memory, one must accept the modest austerity that can follow. Those months taught me humility. I learned how to set aside funds for repairs, how to negotiate with builders about sympathetic restoration rather than wholesale renovation. I attended town council meetings, sometimes alone, and argued for small, community-minded grants that supported local makers and repairers instead of spectacle. I wrote checks for a library in a village outside town where a small archive had no funding. Each small act complicated my old assumptions about what counted as influence. It was not only to be seen at the right table, but to make a table where people could lay their small, private things to be kept. In the course of these years, the steward's health began to decline. He had been with the ledger longer than anyone, a presence who had seen portraits hung and rehung, who had filed away names as rhythms in his body. There came a day when he handed me his key and said, "You will have to learn how to be rigorous about what is asked of the book. It will not ask for miracles. It will ask for steady hands." He taught me then the practice of saying no. "There will be requests that are performative," he said. "There will be petitions for your name. You must judge them not by how loudly they call you, but by how necessary the request is." His retirement was an unceremonious thing. A small tea with the bookshop owner, a handwritten note pinned to the staff room. Yet his absence left a hollow the size of an empty chair. Elliot took over many of the steward's cataloging tasks, but he did so not as a show of power but as a continuation of ordinary care. Watching him work through the steward's routines was like watching a person pick up a beloved tool and discover its gravity. There was the slow learning curve and then, with time, a fluency that made the tasks look inevitable. The years folded in. We marked anniversaries not with grand parties but with the renewal of private vows. On one such evening, with the rain again baking its familiar pattern on the windows, I asked the question I had avoided rehearsing in legal terms. "If the ledger were not part of our life," I said, "if we had no social obligations beyond being kind neighbors, would you still do these things? Would you still tend to names?" He thought for a long time, and I sensed that he was making arithmetic of the heart. "Yes," he said finally. "Not because the ledger tells me so, but because caring for these small histories has become a way I understand how to live. It is a choice that gives me a shape." The answer simplified nothing, and simplified everything. It meant that his actions were not simply the product of a family engine, and it meant that when I made my choice to love him, I was choosing a person with interior practices that sometimes made him absent in one register and present in another. I could have demanded a public partner, an accompanist on the social circuit. Instead, I reoriented my desires. I wanted a companion for the kinds of attention he was developing. I wanted to learn the art of names. There were moments of fatigue, of course. Sometimes I resented the quiet life he preferred because it required me to do more visible labor. Committee work, invitations, hosting. There were dinners where I returned home feeling hollow from the performance of sociality and found him in the study as steady as a clock, embroidering marginal notes into a thin order of paper. Those were the times I had to remind myself that love allowed for asymmetry, and that choosing someone meant sometimes choosing to carry what they could not, for reasons of temperament or vocation, carry in the world of crowds. A small episode made the point. A reporter whose pen had once delighted in our awkwardness asked for a profile on the house's philanthropic pivot. I could have accepted the article as a way to justify the changes we had made, to ease the family's conscience. Elliot advised against it. "Let them think we are whatever they like," he said. "Our work doesn't need their applause." I recognized in his voice the stoicism I had once admired in him. I also recognized the cost. Without public acknowledgement, our choices remained fragile. I chose to respect his judgment and to write a private letter to a handful of the town's leaders explaining our new approach in plain terms. The letter did not make headlines, but it secured a modest grant for a repairs fund that helped 3 local households mend what had begun to fail. There were small miracles and small cruelties along the way. A photograph that had once smeared continued occasionally to produce unexpected negatives, faces that looked slightly transported, a smear where eyes should have been. I could have made an art project of these failures. Instead, I learned to treat them as evidence of the house's particular weather. The bookshop owner printed one of the prints and framed it in a small private show. Elliot approved, but the exhibition was for a handful of friends rather than the public spectacle my cousin had once imagined. People come to have opinions, and some of those opinions were harsh. But I began to value more the circle of people who practiced small attentions with us. The baker who would bake an extra loaf for a widow, the librarian who kept a second key for us, the young courier who would not mention what he carried when he returned a parcel. In quieter ways, our life together hardened into a form of apprenticeship. I taught myself to thread a needle without pricking my thumb. He taught me to read marginalia in a way that let me see how ordinary anger and tenderness were recorded in the margins of lives. We began compiling a pantry ledger for neighbors who needed small things in lean months. Once a month, we replenished it anonymously. We established a small fund to pay for repairs to pews, roofs, and boots. None of these acts were headline-worthy. They were not designed to be called into the public record or turned into gala appeals. They were acts intended to sustain the habit of attention. I cannot claim that the town forgave us entirely. There were people who still joked at our expense, who whispered that Elliot had been changed and could not be relied upon for the public rituals that reinforced social order. Some acquaintances stopped sending invitations. For a time, the charitable committees we had once chaired assumed that we would leave the heavy lifting to those more comfortable with public display. That hurt in ways small and large, yet it also freed us from an expectation that had always been a performance. It allowed us to live in ways that aligned with our moral commitments rather than our social obligations. There was a strange moral alchemy in all this. When one unbinds automatic privilege, one must pay the domestic cost of inventing a life that makes the unbinding sustainable. For us, that meant learning the craft of quiet generosity and of mundane stewardship. It meant that my father, whose books had once been my Bible of image and propriety, began to value receipts and records in a way that surprised him. He recorded with a wry hand the small repairs we made to the house and the names we had restored. He kept a margin column in his own ledgers labeled names, a practice that softened him. Later, when the steward's hands were too stiff to cut a new piece of ribbon, Elliot sat at his place and taught the younger archivist the gentle press needed to flatten creases. The younger man, whose life had once been built around catalog numbers and temperature control, came to understand the human content of the ledger. He wrote to me years later to say that he had learned to listen for names the way one listens for a tune. There is a modest joy in seeing someone inherit an ethic rather than an artifact. There were other changes, too. A neighbor who had once been indifferent accepted our invitation to dinner because his daughter needed the support of a stable place to study. A small church received funding to repair its bell. A baker who had once complained about our charity admitted that he took comfort in the pantry ledger's quiet replenishments. These are not sweeping changes. They are increments of human decency that count for more than their modest scale suggests. And yet ambiguity remained. I would still wake sometimes to the memory of the negative smear and feel the old, irrational fear. What if his change was a thing that would deepen? What if the ledger, in time, demanded more than any mortal could bear? The fear was always balanced by the observation that he had agency. He refused the foundation, he chose private stewardship, he declined spectacle. He also chose me. He chose to keep names, and he chose to keep a life with me. Not as an appendage to his work, but as a companion who could share certain attentions. There was a final small episode that, if not cathartic, felt like the moral thread being knotted with care. One spring, when the bulbs we had planted together pushed up stubborn green, the bookshop owner called to say that an elderly woman had left a trunk of letters in unarranged piles and asked if Elliot could look at them. The trunk belonged to a seamstress who had been a small benefactor to the house generations before, someone whose name had once been a marginal note. Elliot, without fanfare, spent a week transcribing the letters, repairing the brittle paper and sewing them into a tied bundle with a careful label. When he returned the trunk, there was a short note attached. "For the village, with thanks." The seamstress's great-granddaughter wept when she received the bundle. She wrote us a long letter in which she described holding her ancestor's voice in her hands as if it had been returned to her. The letter spoke of memory made real, of names that found their place again. I kept that letter in my desk and read it when I felt the old pangs of doubt. It was proof that the quiet work sometimes had consequences beyond our small expectations. It confirmed that tending to marginal lives did not only serve the ledger's dignity, but restored people's sense of themselves. Years folded into a pattern. Small liturgies, occasional crises, a public world that sometimes mocked and sometimes admired us. Our life was not dramatic, but sustained. The photograph remained in a drawer, its smear a stubborn artifact. Once in a while someone would raise it, as if to ask whether we had merely traded one kind of spectacle for another. We did not respond with manifestos. We responded with work. I think now about what the ledger ultimately asked of us. Not a sacrifice in the theatrical sense, but a willingness to make certain kinds of choices repeatedly. The great moral question, the one that circles like a hawk, was never whether someone would be forced into an obligation, but how households convert obligation into chosen practice. For us, the ledger's presence functioned as a moral provocation. What would we do with the knowledge of names? How would we honor them without turning them into tokenism? The answer I've come to see is neither heroic nor inert. It is patient and mundane, and requires the daily attention we had previously reserved for social performance. In the end, what we learned, Elliot and I, was a practice of renewals. On certain nights, we would read aloud names we had recorded in the week. On others, we would write letters. We instituted a small annual day of recordings, in which we would invite a neighbor to tell a story they remembered about someone in the ledger. The practice kept us accountable. It also provided a kind of pleasure that was not based on applause. To be the people who did the small work was to feel a continuity that did not weigh as a burden, but settled as habit. The photograph never stopped troubling me. Sometimes I would take it out and lay it on the table and let my fingers trace the blurred place where eyes should be. Slowly, I learned to read it as a record of the house's weather rather than as an indictment. It mattered less whether his blink had failed, and more that we had learned to see him as a person who had chosen certain attentions. That choice required me to reframe my own metrics of worth. I became less voracious for public notice and more invested in the architecture of small ethics. If the headline of our story, as the tabloids would like to write it, is that the husband stopped acting human, then the truth we lived was different. He altered the register of his action. He traded performative presence for a generous if quiet stewardship. He refused to let the ledger become an instrument of spectacle. He insisted, in practical ways, that memory be maintained as an ethic rather than used as a brand. I confess that at times my desire for a life that looked a certain way did not perfectly align with this new horizon. I struggled with jealousy and with a sense that I had been given a version of marriage I had not ordered. But I also learned the value of being a partner to someone's project that is morally demanding and socially unrewarded. There are no tidy endings here. The steward retires fully in time. The younger archivist learns to love the practice. The ledger remains on its shelf. We keep our rituals. Tea at precisely the time the shadows tilt. The pantry list. A monthly reading of names. Sometimes Elliot still refuses to be photographed beyond our private albums. Sometimes he allows a friend to take a candid shot that makes it into our small family scrapbook. Sometimes he blinks at me in public in a way that makes the world fall away for a moment. Sometimes he looks at a page as if listening to a voice across the years. What I want to leave with you, what I continue to live by, is a simple conviction. Choosing someone is not a single act. It is a series of small, often invisible practices enacted over years. To choose is to accept ambiguity, and to be willing to make the work of unbinding privilege something you live into daily. It is to trade some of the glamour of public recognition for the steadier light of craft. It is to remember that names in the margins are people, and that keeping them is an act of moral fidelity, not a spectacle. I will end then with an invitation, because even a story that prefers the domestic deserves a passing toward the world that reads it. If this has stirred something in you, if the question of what you would give to keep a name, or what it would cost you to choose someone apart from public spectacle, leave a note. Tell me in the space below what small thing would mark your choice. How would you keep a name? How would you show up for someone who asked nothing public of you? I promise to read them, as I have read so many marginal notes with the same attentive hands.